Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome everyone to the second day of Nature-Based Solutions Digital Dialogues 2020. For those of you who weren't able to join us yesterday, my name is Natalie Seddon. I am Director of the Nature-Based Solutions Initiative in the Department of Zoology at the University of Oxford, and we are hosts of this online event. So this is the third webinar of the 6 that make up Nature-Based Solutions Digital Dialogues. Yesterday, we discussed the role of nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation, debated the value of biological offsetting, explored the critical importance of ecosystems other than forests for climate change mitigation and adaptation, and highlighted the need to move the NbS narrative to a whole landscapes approach. These topics reflected the first 2 of the 4 guiding principles for successful, sustainable nature-based solutions that were set out at the beginning of the year in a letter to the UK government COP26 president. Today, we will be highlighting the role of people and biodiversity at the heart of nature-based solutions, reflecting the 3rd and 4th of these principles. So this morning, we were very much hoping that Professor Sandra Lavarelle from CNRS would be joining us right now to give the second plenary of this event. However, we're very sorry to say that she's not been able to join us from New Zealand so far, but we are very much hoping that between now and the start of the next session at 1 p.m, she'll be able to get in touch with us and she'll be able to deliver this second keynote. So we will present the revised start time of her keynote if she is able to join us as soon as we know it. Otherwise, I will welcome you back at 1 p.m. for Stuart McGuinness's talk from IUCN. Thank you very much.
Do you want to start to just check?
Yeah. Hello, Sandra. Now it gives me enormous pleasure.
I was muted, sorry. I was muted,
okay,
sorry.
No problem at all. Now it gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Professor Sandra Lavarelle, who is joining us from New Zealand, where I think the current time is close to midnight, and who will be giving the second note of this event's 3 keynotes. Trained as an agronomer, Sandra has been an ecologist at the French CNRS since 1994, where she is now a top-level senior researcher at the Alpine Ecology Laboratory in Grenoble. After a PhD in plant community ecology, Sandra's career has been dedicated to linking global change impacts on biodiversity to changes in ecosystem functioning. She has played a major role in the development of functional trait-based approaches, initially on plants and then across whole trophic levels, to address questions ranging from disturbance responses to biodiversity effects on ecosystem functioning and to the quantification of ecosystem services. Sandra's current research focuses on impacts on ecosystems and their services of combined changes in climate and land management, and how their understanding can support social adaptation to climate change in mountain and other temperate regions. She coordinates the Transformative Adaptation Research Alliance, which develops concepts and case studies across the world on ecosystem-based adaptation. This highly interdisciplinary research at the interface between functional ecology, social sciences, and the humanities, with a close participation of local and regional stakeholders, contributes to national and also international biodiversity and ecosystem assessments. Sandra chaired the French National Ecosystem Assessment from 2013 to 2019 and has been an active contributor to assessments of the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. In particular, she was lead author of the European Central Asian Assessment, where she coordinated the work on pathways to sustainable futures. She joined the multidisciplinary expert panel of IPBES in 2018. So Sandra has received numerous awards, including the Silver Medal of CNRS, the Alexander von Humboldt Medal of International Association for Vegetation Science, and the Marsh Award from the British Ecological Society. She was also elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences in 2013 and as a foreign member of the US National Academy of Sciences in 2020. Sandra, it is a tremendous pleasure to welcome you to Digital Dialogues. We look forward to hearing your keynote. Over to you, please. You may share your screen.
Just a second. Share screen. Okay. Right. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, that's great. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Get rid of this one. Sorry. All right, here we go. Well, thanks, Natalie, for the introduction, and mostly thanks for the invitation to participate in these digital dialogues, a bit of an unusual exercise. I'm extremely honored to be with you all today, across the world, I guess. And today I'm going to be talking on nature's contributions to adaptation, thinking about how nature and people can work together for climate change adaptation. So my presentation today will focus on how nature can support people's adaptation to climate change and what understanding we have of how this can be enhanced and facilitated. As you would all know, climate change is upon all of us. Its impacts on nature and people are clearly revealed, and projections leave no doubt that there are already and there will be a major component of future lives. Indeed, climate change impacts on all components of nature, whether the species we depend on or cherish, or essential processes of cycling carbon, water, and nutrients that make this planet livable, fill our dinner plates, and support our physical safety. The recent synthesis by the global assessment by the International Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, NbS, showed very clearly, as summarized in the bar graph on the right-hand side of the slide here, that the vast majority of scenarios of social models and their resulting impacts on climate, under most of these scenarios, biodiversity will be lost, regulating contributions of nature to people will decrease, and gains in material contributions will not even be secured for all across the world. Climate change also affects directly the resources and assets that deliver benefits from nature's biodiversity and functions to people. For example, access or risk management infrastructure, but also human capital. And yeah, sorry, as to interrupt, can people see my mouse when I point to the?
Yes, yeah, we can see the mouse, no problem.
Yes, yeah, okay, so I'll be using that. It is just clear that the interlinked effects of climate on natural and social components of the world threaten the good quality of life for all across the planet. As acknowledged by recent IPCC reports, climate and increasingly as acknowledged by recent IPCC reports and climate policy as well as all other policy domains, it is therefore now clear that adaptation, climate change is a priority, whatever future trajectories of abatement might be taken. In this context, a simple definition of adaptation can be given as the set of actions and decisions to respond to or anticipate climate change impacts on social ecosystems. What I will be asking in this presentation today is how nature can support adaptation. I will consider that this is not a passive proposition, but rather that the question we need to ask in asking how nature can support adaptation is how can people increase potential contributions of biodiversity and ecosystem functioning to adaptation through acting on ecosystems and on the factors that determine the flow of benefits to people. So the little green arrows on this figure here. In so doing, we need to consider where the leverage points for adaptation sit and can be activated across all components of the ecosystem. And in my presentation today, as shown by the green arrows on this figure here, I'll concentrate on the pathways that lead from drivers to nature and to nature's contributions to people. Nature-based solutions are broadly defined by the IUCN as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity benefits. As such, they encompass multiple types of actions, including protecting biodiversity, conserving and restoring ecosystems, and targeted management of specific ecosystems or ecological functions, ecological engineering, and a wide range of actions. I'm not going to cover the whole breadth of nature-based solutions today, but rather focus on adaptation services, trying to understand how nature can help people reduce climate risk and provide future livelihood options. The concept of adaptation services starts from the understanding that under climate change, some ecosystems will be resilient and persist, while others will inevitably transform over time. For example, some forests where species are tolerant of drought or can recover after fire or wind throw are expected to be resilient, whereas those dominated by sensitive species are bound to transform to more tolerant species, as already seen in some parts of the world. With this, we thus acknowledge that either resilience or transformability are ecological properties from which people can benefit to build their adaptation actions. For resilience ecosystems, a number of adaptation services might benefit to people's adaptation to climate change. The first type being what we call latent services. So in other words, ecosystem services whose values gets revealed through climate change and for adaptation. A common example being climate mitigation. But also some ecosystem services will simply be sustained by those resilient ecosystems. When on the other hand, ecosystems do transform, they might sustain previously existing ecosystem services to previous or even increased levels, but there will be some novel ecosystem services emerging. A few examples for these. So perhaps the best known are services of climate mitigation and risk mitigation under climate change. For example, here on this picture, carbon sequestrations in forests and soils, and the presence of species in pastures that have strong, that act as strong funnels of carbon to the soils. In terms of risk mitigation, for instance, control of erosion for more intense rainfall or control of floods. I insisted in my definition of adaptation services that resilience and transformability of ecosystems, and especially of ecosystems that are more diverse and more connected, are also properties that benefit adaptation. Lastly, novel ecosystems from new and from transformed ecosystems might emerge, allowing new economic activities and also the development of new values. I will now turn to what people experience in their lives on the ground, making the point that while scientists or decision makers may often focus on one climate driver and its impacts and one solution at a time, real life is different. First, although for important reasons, climate projections are presented one variable at a time, of course, each species, ecosystem, or human activity respond to multiple variables. For example, here are shown 7 climate variables that were considered as important by stakeholders of Hawke's Bay here on the eastern North Island of New Zealand, where people consider these to be the variables that would impact their activities and especially various production activities. Sorry. So it's these variables, while named by the stakeholders, are not perceived one at a time, but all affect the activities of stakeholders. It seems therefore relevant to consider rather than combinations. And on the left-hand side of the map of the Hawke's Bay region here, we have such combined changes clearly highlighting that while in some parts of the regions shown in blue here, like mountains and coastal areas, these will only be exposed largely to a single driver. Some other regions shown in red, like the inland plateau or the horticulture and viticulture areas, they will experience combined changes in, for example, increasing drought, increasing temperature, and also more intense rainfall events. So in this context, adaptation is therefore about making decisions across all these impacts. These multiple climate change drivers impact not one, but multiple dimensions of nature and its contribution to people, as shown by this global synthesis. When focusing on specific social ecosystems, this results in changes in bundles of ecosystem services. So on the left-hand side of the slide, the gray spider diagram presents the current set of contributions from inland floodplains of Australia to people in and beyond the region. In this current state, a strong focus on material benefits here through irrigation trades off against many regulating contribution and biodiversity, which has much lower level. So next, white set of spokes on the diagram shows how each of these ecosystem services change under a climate change scenario, and accordingly to the findings at on a broader scale for a specific ecosystem, we will have change in a whole range of ecosystem services resulting from these multiple drivers. A number of nature-based solutions projects around the world address climate change as a primary or broader objective. One may cite projects are based on climate mitigation, for example, REDD+. So some projects target single drivers and impacts with a given action. For instance, restoring coastal vegetation for storm surges, wetlands or riparian vegetation for flood regulation, or urban greening for temperature regulation. But there are nearly always co-benefits, for example, for local and global climate mitigation, biodiversity, habitat, recreation, and identities. At the other end of the spectrum, nature-based solutions focused on nature protection intend to be more integrative. In terms of adaptation services, the slide here summarizes results from a study in the French Alps, where we quantified different adaptation services from different land use types within the landscape mosaic. In this figure, the size of circles represents the magnitude of each adaptation service, which are the columns, for each land use type, the rows. Overall, farmers and other stakeholders manage and benefit from the whole range of adaptation services across land uses. A quick glance at this figure highlights along the rows the bundles of adaptation services from each land use. First, within each land use type, some adaptation services are deliberately managed, while others often come as co-benefits. Second, some land uses show trade-offs in their sets of adaptation services, shown by the red arrows here in the figure, which can also be interpreted as complementarities across land uses within the landscape. To sum up, adaptation can be conceptualized as integrated responses to multiple impacts of multiple drivers, where bundles of adaptation services, the spheres on the slide, are co-managed. I will now move to showing how we can take this observation further to understand underlying ecological and social mechanisms that may support people's adaptation. Since I'm based in New Zealand today, I'll take some examples from here. And in the next few slides, I will use some of the cases based on an ongoing synthesis of such integrated nature-based solutions. This slide here shows examples ranging from management interventions on farmland, on the top row, to nature management for protection of native ecosystems like tufted grasslands or native forests, and for control of invasive species, and ranging all the way to ecosystem restoration. To dig a bit deeper into these examples, let us consider adaptation to ongoing simultaneous challenges from drought and associated fire risk and more frequent floods. Two types of solutions on farmland, pasture diversification and native plantings, each target a bundle of synergistic adaptation services. In contrast, managing wild conifers that escape out of plantations can involve foregoing some adaptation benefits to mitigate risks from fire, biodiversity threats, and loss of aesthetic value. If we take an analytical approach to these solutions as bundles of adaptation services, we need to consider drivers, impacts, solutions, and their underpinning ecological mechanisms and the adaptation benefits they provide. Let us start here with response to increasing drought which puts fodder production at risk. With concurring effects on loss of soil and nutrients in grasslands. Solution that farmers are currently developing under the notion of resilient pastures involves essentially diversifying the composition and choosing species that will provide resilience of fodder production mainly. These are based on a number of mechanisms associated with the diversity of plants and soil biota as well as soil properties found in these grasslands and facilitated by multiple species mixes, which in turn will facilitate adaptation through, of course, sustaining fodder production, but produce interesting co-benefits for erosion reduction, water quality regulation, and carbon sequestration. Sorry, I'm having a bit of trouble going to the next slide. Here we go. I mentioned that drought doesn't come along alone in the same regions. There's also recurrence of more intense rainfall events, which among other impacts, impacts not only fodder production and soils, but also increases flood risks in the watersheds. The solution that people are calling upon here is the increase in on-farm semi-natural vegetation, whose properties and functions for water infiltration ensures flood regulation, but also co-benefits like carbon sequestration, water purification, and erosion reduction. Lastly, the driver of increased atmospheric concentration in CO2 has obviously strong impacts on climate, global vulnerability, or rather than local vulnerability, to which there is strong policy and drive here to develop so-called greenhouse gas compliant pastures so as to be able to sequester more carbon and reduce nitrogen oxides emissions based also on the properties of the composition of these grasslands. So to sum up, the solutions of diversification of pastures and favoring planting of woody vegetation on farms addresses multiple hazards. So the hazards of, common hazards of dry climate, extreme rainfall linked to increased atmospheric CO2, and ensuing effects potentially on land abandonment. These solutions, so plantings, pasture diversification, and greenhouse gas compliant pasture composition, support multiple synergistic adaptation services at the bottom here. And through an analytical approach like the one presented here, a simplified version presented here, it is possible to identify common and complementary supporting properties of plants, soils, and landscapes. Further, because it's all about managing for these solutions, what we need to understand is how people can act for these nature's contributions, these contributions of nature to adaptation. So first, obviously, ecosystems need to be managed to provide such adaptation services and solutions by either farmers, conservation managers, and community groups. The second part of the chain from delivering these benefits to people from the ecosystems involve harvesting, accessing the ecosystems, perhaps transforming them, and distribution products as well as value development. All of these are strongly controlled and depending on multiple social dimensions such as societal values of managers and also wider society, knowledge and know-how, extension services. They're submitted to regulation by environmental policies and, for example, access rights, and depend strongly on social capital of farmers, catchment networks, including farmers and other inhabitants, as well as their power relations. Also, infrastructure and financial capital are essential so that these benefits can be realized. So to sum up, nature can support social adaptation to climate change through the resilience and transformability of ecosystems and their biodiversity. These enable reducing climate risks and providing future options. Such adaptation services are managed and governed by people as bundles of solutions to respond to multiple impacts of combined climate and other drivers. Understanding underlying ecological and social mechanisms, like I've very briefly illustrated here, is essential to empower people for working with nature for climate adaptation. And this concept of production of adaptation pathways, adaptation actions, and therefore pathways by nature of people is what we believe is going to be essential for developing nature-based solutions to climate. With this, I'll thank you for your attention, and I'll be very pleased to answer questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandra. That was absolutely a brilliant and fascinating talk and a great way to start this second day. We've got various questions here that we'd like to ask, and hopefully there'll be time to get through some of them. So there's a real tension at the moment in this sort of nature-based solutions community around the positioning of biodiversity, you know, as we would define it, the diversity of, you know, from the level of genes to the level of ecosystem, as a inherent property of a good, reliable, sustainable nature-based solution versus as an outcome alongside human well-being. So in some frameworks, you'll be aware that people say, well, you know, if we do nature-based solutions right, we have positive outcomes in terms of human well-being and biodiversity. And in others, it's more like seeing biodiversity as a property. So I wonder whether you might reflect on that. Thank you.
Yes, well, that's an excellent and very tricky question, I think. So my belief here is that we shouldn't be on either one side or the other. The examples I've shown here insisted rather on biodiversity as supporting adaptation and nature-based solutions. What I didn't get a chance to insist on, because I didn't really develop the cultural dimension, especially of the non-material values and also just the intrinsic values of biodiversities, these all need to be taken into account as part of thinking about adaptation. Also, I guess something that we should not forget about is by taking this, in a way, instrumental view to biodiversity and to adaptation, this doesn't waive off the responsibility of people towards conserving biodiversity. And therefore, from that perspective, I'd lean to the other side. So I'm going to give a half full, half empty glass type of response here, I think.
No, that's great, and it's definitely a conversation that's ongoing. And in fact, later this afternoon, we'll be also tackling that question from a variety of different perspectives and different sort of ecosystems. So we've got some questions coming in for the Q&A chat, and also things that we've sort of thought about a lot in previous sessions, and probably we're reflecting on more in following sessions. It's like, how do we secure the engagement of stakeholders from the get-go with nature-based solutions, when it often takes a very long time for these ecosystem services to manifest themselves, you know? And I think, you know, there's lots of questions here about, you know, how do we take the different stakeholders on board at those different stages, and how do we take the effect of time into account? Because time affects when ecosystem services get delivered, and it also affects the trade-offs between these different ecosystem services. And the key, you know, and I know a lot of your work is really focused on this sort of this piece around the stakeholders. So if you could unpack that a little more, that would be great.
Yes. So a few points that could be made here. The first one is one of being a little modest with respect to adaptation, which is that very often when we try to think about these solutions in the context of climate change adaptation, one would like to think that people are going to be proactive and be able to think of solutions in advance. Whereas reality and, well, either scientific case studies or all sorts of observations reveal that this is kind of an idealized version of the world, where most of that adaptation is actually reactive for a number of reasons I won't have time to develop here. So one of the ways to engage stakeholders is actually to engage them not necessarily around this, the climate threat and climate adaptation, but to engage them around the things that, the elements that underpin their livelihoods, because very often there will actually be convergence. So for example, in some of the regions where we have worked in several, for example, several mountains around the world, climates might be present and there are threats and might come to the front for some people, but most of the time their livelihoods are threatened or difficult due to other factors. And it's by bringing this awareness in general about change and adaptation that they can then be brought on board for climate adaptation. The second one, which we found quite useful, is to actually engage people in thinking about their past adaptations, so more or less recent past adaptations. And this is a way to really illustrate how adaptation processes work, as I've pointed out here, about a combination of ecological and social mechanisms. And by recognizing things that people are familiar with and that relate to their identities in their places, in their histories, it's actually easier to then engage them in thinking about future climate change.
Okay, thank you. So the adaptation services concept, this is a question from Beth Turner in Canada. The adaptation services concept seems really useful for looking at options for changing management to facilitate adaptation, but this requires a lot of scientific input to assess these pathways. Can you see a way that local communities would be able to apply it on their own? And how do we tap into that rich sort of indigenous and local knowledge about ecosystems and how to manage them and maintain their resilience to inform these pathway assessments?
Right. Well, there are a number of questions in the question here.
Sorry.
So the first one is how to engage indigenous and local knowledge in developing understanding and practice of adaptation services. What people have found, for example, with studies in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific, is that in reality, what we brought as scientists with our concepts and well-constructed adaptation services formalism was actually very uneasy to understand to people doing adaptation on the ground. I'm thinking here of colleagues working in Vanuatu, for instance, where people are dealing with urgent questions of sea level rise and basically in some cases having to move islands, not being able to grow their crops, etc., etc. And in workshops that were held there last year, it was pretty obvious that people were thinking in terms of these solutions already, although it wasn't formalized in that way. In other places, there's been work also in Arctic communities, where again, people are already thinking in these terms, but not formalized in that way. And the scientific process is then to help bring this understanding to the forth. In terms of developing pathways that are based or incorporate adaptation services, I guess most of the time, well, as far as I'm familiar with, that's a process that's been guided by scientists, but very often with strong partnerships with local communities, either their leaders or community groups. Nevertheless, I think it's a really good question to think whether people could actually be empowered to develop their own pathways. And to be honest, with the work that I very, very briefly referred to in the French Alps, our very humble idea and ambition with this study is not so much the pathways that we are developing with people, but more how we are actually building capability with that community to be able to do that themselves, because we are almost convinced they're not going to use the solutions that we are producing in workshops. That's not even the objective, but what it is about is the process, which we're hoping they could apply themselves later.
Thank you. A few questions around how we deal with uncertainty. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty about the resilience of ecosystems to different stresses, climate change in combination with all the other ones that are then amplified by climate change. And there's a lot of still some uncertainty about the relationship between different properties of biodiversity and their resilience, and also uncertainties about the trajectory of climate change. We have a question here from Scott Jones, who says, a common question for many of us though is, how can we be sure of the trajectory of climate change? And he says, some of your diagrams assumed increasing wetness or a certain direction of temperature change, for example.
Okay. Again, a question with several layers here. I think some qualitative trends might be quite certain. Their magnitude may not be. So that that's the first thing that one needs to work with. The second one is the essentially the notion of robust or scenario-proof solutions, which basically consists in considering adaptation to a range of climate scenarios, or sometimes to the worst possible case. So that's a way to, well, number one, get people familiar with the range of possible futures. And also referring to resilience, it's the most kind of the bulletproof approach is to think if we base adaptation on resilience, it's likely to work for lesser than for worse climate impacts and other drivers. So yeah, a short way to answer that question. But the message here is really make the uncertainty pretty transparent to participants is the first step.
So we're coming to the end of this, but there are a couple of, well, there are lots more questions. Obviously, we would love to talk to you for a long time, but just to end with just a couple of ones actually. So one question is about, this is from Trishna, who says, how do we start to think about scaling? So there's a whole issue of how we scale out and how we scale up, because as we know, we can all point to examples of where climate adaptation and use of nature for climate adaptation is working very well locally, you know, very place specific. So how can we think about, everyone talks about, you know, it's in the narrative, you know, we need to scale up, we need to scale out nature-based solutions, but what does that look like in practice? And then the second question is a bit more about how we improve the sort of the synergies between nature-based solutions for mitigation, nature-based solutions for adaptation, because one of the goals of this meeting and other meetings over the next 12 months is trying to bring these communities together, not just the policy communities, but the scientists communities as well. And in recent times, the whole world of nature-based solutions seems to have been a little bit dominated by, say, the mitigation side, but really, you know, these two things need to work together. So if you could answer those two, and then we'll need to wrap up. Thank you.
Yes. Well, in a way, you've answered the first one with the second one, haven't you? That's the answer I was going to give, was communities of practice. Regional networks, really very important, and showing by example, thinking again back about some of our own practice, and yeah, I'm thinking of these recent studies that we're having in the French Alps. You know, people from one other place might somehow find out that something's happening and come and listen to a public meeting and say, okay, let's try that and adapt that for our place. So it's very much about networking. But this being said, that's not sufficient. So I suspect participants to this conference will be familiar with the different types of scaling. So scaling out, which is essentially replicating the same solutions in various places, but also scaling up, which means addressing governance and drivers at higher levels, and scaling deep, which is changing people's values. So we need a combination of all three. It's not only about trying to replicate and adapt to other places, adapt the adaptation solutions to tailor the solutions to other places.
Very many thanks indeed. Thank you for a wonderful, thought-provoking talk, and thank you also for those very carefully considered answers to the questions. There are other answers that have been posed, and hopefully we'll be able to the questions that have been posed, and hopefully we'll be able to share some answers to those in follow-up. So thank you also, especially because I know you're joining us from New Zealand, and it's very late there. We do appreciate your engagement with us, and thanks very much. And
thank you very much.
And thanks all to a wonderful audience. Thanks for sending in your questions. So we will be back for panel 3, which is nature-based solutions with, by, and for people in 1 hour. So please rejoin this webinar at 1 o'clock, when we will hear from Stuart McGuinness from IUCN about the NbS Global Standard, and he will also be setting the scene for today's panel discussions. So thank you very much.